In 1985, the man who built Apple Computer was escorted out of his own company. He was 30 years old. He had just been stripped of all his responsibilities, and the board he had chosen had voted to remove him. Steve Jobs drove home that day, sat in his empty mansion, and didn't know what to do with his life. 12 years later, he walked back into Apple, a company that was 90 days from bankruptcy, and turned it into the most valuable company in human history. This is the story of the greatest comeback in business history, and the 3 decisions that made it possible. It started in a garage in Los Altos, California, 1976. Steve Jobs was 21. Steve Wozniak was 25. Together, they built a computer on a wooden board and sold it for $666. Jobs had the vision. Wozniak had the technical genius. Together, they were unstoppable. By 1980, Apple went public, and Steve Jobs became a millionaire at 25. By 1984, they launched the Macintosh with one of the most famous commercials in history, aired during the Super Bowl, directed by Ridley Scott. Apple was worth over $1 billion. Jobs was on the cover of every magazine in America. And then, everything fell apart. The problem wasn't Apple's products. The problem was Steve Jobs himself. Jobs was brilliant, but he was also brutal. He screamed at employees. He told engineers their work was garbage. He fired people in elevator rides. The board decided they needed a professional CEO to manage the growing company. They hired John Sculley, the man who had run Pepsi. At first, Jobs and Sculley were close. Jobs had personally recruited Sculley with one of the most famous lines in business history. Do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life? Or do you want to come with me and change the world? Sculley chose Apple, but within 2 years, he chose Apple over Jobs. In May 1985, the board voted. Jobs was stripped of his division. His access cards were canceled. At 30 years old, Steve Jobs was pushed out of the company he had founded. He later said it was the most devastating moment of his life. But here's what most people don't know about the years after Jobs left Apple. He didn't retire. He didn't give up. He started a new computer company called Next, spending $12 million of his own money. The computers were beautiful and revolutionary, but they were also too expensive and too late. Next nearly failed. Then, almost by accident, Jobs bought a small animation studio from George Lucas for $5 million. That studio was called Pixar. Nobody believed in Pixar. Disney had already rejected their pitches. Jobs himself considered selling it multiple times. But in 1995, Pixar released Toy Story, the first fully computer-animated feature film in history. It made $362 million at the box office. Jobs had gone from being fired at Apple to owning one of the most creative companies on earth. And then, Apple called. By 1996, Apple was dying. They had lost $1 billion in a single year. Their market share had collapsed from 16% to under 4%. Microsoft Windows had taken over the world. Apple was 90 days from running out of money entirely. In desperation, Apple's new CEO, Gil Amelio, decided to buy Next, Jobs' struggling computer company, for $429 million. The plan was just to buy the software, but Jobs came with it. Within months, the board fired Amelio and asked Jobs to take over. Jobs returned to Apple in 1997. He walked in, looked at Apple's product line, which had over 350 products, and immediately cut it down to just 10. He said, "Deciding what not to do is as important as deciding what to do." Then he did something that shocked everyone. He called Microsoft, Apple's biggest rival, and made a deal. Microsoft invested $150 million in Apple and agreed to keep making Microsoft Office for Mac. The crowd at Apple's developer conference booed when they saw Bill Gates on screen. Jobs told them, We have to let go of this notion that for Apple to win, Microsoft has to lose. What happened next changed the entire technology industry. 1998. iMac. Apple's first hit product in years. 2001. iPod. It didn't invent the MP3 player. It just made the best one. 2003. iTunes Store. It saved the entire music industry. 2007. iPhone. It didn't just change phones. It changed everything. 2010. iPad. A new product category nobody knew they needed. By 2011, Apple had become the most valuable company on Earth, worth more than ExxonMobil, more than Microsoft, more than any company in history. The man they fired in a garage in 1985 had built the most valuable enterprise in human history by 2011. Steve Jobs died in October 2011. He was 56 years old, but the company he saved is today worth over $3 trillion. So what can you learn from Steve Jobs? 1. Being fired, failing, or losing everything is not the end. For Jobs, it was the beginning of his greatest work. 2. Focus is a superpower. Apple had 350 products. Jobs cut them to 10. That decision saved the company. 3. Your biggest rival is not always your enemy. The Microsoft deal kept Apple alive long enough to change the world. The most valuable company on Earth started in a garage, nearly died twice, and was saved by the man it had fired. If you want more billion-dollar business stories like this, subscribe. Because next week, we're covering the rise and fall of Blockbuster and the one decision that cost them $50 billion. See you then.